Imagine for a moment that you are facing one of the biggest armies the ancient world has ever seen. Millions of soldiers stretched out as far as you can see, their armor shining under the sun. Warships cover the ocean like a forest of tall poles. The king who leads this army is thought of as a living god by his people. Now imagine you're one of only 300 men chosen to face this army that seems to go on forever. No help is coming. You have no way to escape. You have only your friends at your side, your weapons in your hands, and a plan so bold it seems crazy. This is the true story of how 300 Spartans led by King Leonidas faced the greatest empire of ancient times at a rocky pass called Thermopylae. It's the story of how discipline, courage, and a game-changing military trick turned an impossible battle into one of the most amazing in human history. If you want to discover the secrets behind this legendary battle, don't forget to subscribe. But our story doesn't begin at Thermopylae. It begins many years earlier in the dry mountains of Sparta, where men were shaped like red-hot iron. To understand what happened at Thermopylae, we must first understand who the Spartans were. They weren't just soldiers. They were the product of a way of life completely dedicated to warfare, a unique human experiment in history. In Sparta, a man's life was decided from birth. Newborn babies were examined by the city's elders. Those thought to be weak or defective were abandoned in the mountains, a harsh practice that made sure only the strongest survived to become warriors. At the age of 7, Spartan boys were taken from their families and brought to military camps, where the agoge, the most demanding training system in the ancient world, began. Over the next 13 years, these boys would be shaped into human war machines. The training was brutal, beyond imagination. Young Spartans slept on the hard ground, ate purposely small meals to teach them how to handle hunger, and were constantly tested in combat. They learned to handle extreme pain without showing weakness. One of the most feared tests was the yearly ritual at the altar of Artemis, where young Spartans were whipped almost to death, and those who screamed or begged for mercy were considered failures. But the agoge didn't just teach physical toughness. The Spartans developed the most advanced military formation of their time, the hoplite Phalanx. This formation was like a living wall of bronze and iron, with each warrior carrying a round bronze shield, called an aspis, weighing about 15 pounds, and an 8-foot iron spear called a dory. The secret of the Phalanx wasn't only in its weapons, but in the absolute discipline needed to maintain it. Each Spartan had to completely trust the man at his side. A warrior's shield protected not only himself but also the friend to his right. If a single man broke formation or ran away, the entire line could collapse. Spartan mothers were famous for handing their shields to their sons with the words, "Return with it or on it." This phrase wasn't just a call to courage. It was a literal instruction. A warrior who lost his shield in battle had broken ranks and abandoned his friends. The only honorable way to return without a shield was to be killed, carried on it by the survivors. For many years, this military machine worked perfectly. The Spartans were unbeatable in open fields. Their phalanxes crushed any force that dared to fight them. Entire cities surrendered upon hearing that the Spartans were marching toward them. But while Sparta was perfecting its art of war, on the other side of the known world, an empire was growing that would soon make the Spartans look small in comparison. The Persian Empire began as a small tribe in the mountains of what is now Iran, but under the leadership of visionary leaders like Cyrus the Great and later Darius the Great, the Persians conquered territory after territory, absorbing entire cultures, technologies, and armies into their growing empire. Within just a few decades, the Persian Empire stretched from India to Egypt, from Central Asia to the shores of the Black Sea. It was the largest empire the world had ever seen, ruling over tens of millions of people and hundreds of different cultures. The secret to Persian success wasn't just military, it was administrative. Unlike other conquerors who simply robbed and destroyed, the Persians were masters at bringing conquered peoples into their imperial system. They allowed local cultures to keep their traditions and religions as long as they paid tribute and provided soldiers when needed. This system created an army unlike anything seen before. The Persian forces were not made up only of Persians. They were a multinational coalition that included Scythian archers, Bactrian cavalry, Egyptian infantry, Assyrian engineers, and dozens of other specialized groups. When Darius became king in 522 BC, he inherited not only a vast empire, but also unlimited ambition. The Greek city-states on the coast of Asia Minor, which had been conquered by the Persians, began to rebel, supported by Athens and other Greek cities on the mainland. For Darius, this Greek interference in Persian affairs was intolerable. He sent an army across the Aegean Sea to punish the Greeks. But on a plain near a small town called Marathon, something unexpected happened. The Athenians, led by General Miltiades, developed a game-changing tactic. Instead of facing the Persians with a traditional line, they strengthened their wings and deliberately weakened the center. When the Persians attacked, the Greek center retreated in a controlled way, luring the Persians into a trap. Then the strengthened Greek wings closed like the jaws of pincers, surrounding and destroying the best Persian troops. The defeat at Marathon was a shock to the Persian Empire. Never before had such a small force defeated a Persian army so completely. Darius vowed revenge, but died before he could carry it out. His son Xerxes inherited not only the throne, but also his father's thirst for revenge. Xerxes was different from Darius. Where his father was calculating and practical, Xerxes was emotional and proud. The defeat at Marathon was not just a military setback for him. It was a personal insult that demanded full payback. Xerxes spent 4 years preparing the largest military expedition in ancient history. He gathered resources from across his empire, built bridges across the Hellespont to allow his army to cross from Asia to Europe, and dug a canal through the Mount Athos Peninsula to allow his fleet to pass safely. The numbers were impressive. Herodotus, the Greek historian, spoke of an army of over 2 million men, though modern historians estimate the true number was probably between 200,000 and 400,000 soldiers. Still, it was a force larger than anything the Greeks could gather. Xerxes himself was an impressive figure, tall even by the standards of his time. He dressed in gold-decorated clothing and was carried in a golden seat. His subjects literally laid themselves flat on the ground as he passed. To the Persians, Xerxes was not just a king. He was a god on earth, the direct representative of Ahura Mazda. The Persian fleet was equally impressive. Over 1,000 warships, including the famous Phoenician and Egyptian triremes, lined the coast, supplying the army and making sure the Greeks could not use their naval power. As this gigantic force began its march through Thrace and Macedonia, city after city surrendered without resistance. Some Greek states sent ambassadors offering land and water, the traditional symbols of submission to the great Persian king. But 2 cities did not send ambassadors: Athens and Sparta. In Athens, the Democratic Assembly voted to resist, motivated by leaders like Themistocles, who argued that Greek freedom was worth any sacrifice. The Athenians began evacuating their city, sending women and children to nearby islands, and preparing to fight to the death. In Sparta, the response was even more direct. When Xerxes' ambassadors arrived asking for land and water, the Spartans threw them into a deep well, shouting that there they could find all the land and water they wanted. This response sealed the fate of both empires. Xerxes could not allow such an insult to go unpunished. The Spartans knew they had declared war on the mightiest power on earth, but their honor allowed no other choice. King Leonidas of Sparta was a man of about 60 when he received word that Xerxes was marching south. He was an experienced warrior who had undergone rigorous Spartan training and commanded troops in several smaller campaigns. But nothing in his experience had prepared him to face a force the size of Xerxes' army. The ephors, the elected magistrates who governed Sparta alongside the kings, consulted the oracle of Delphi about the coming war. The prophecy they received was grim. Either Sparta would be destroyed or one of its kings would die defending the city. Leonidas understood the meaning of the prophecy. If Sparta was to survive, he would have to die. It was a price he was willing to pay. But Leonidas was also a brilliant strategist. He knew that 300 Spartans, even the finest warriors in the world, couldn't hold off 2 million Persians in an open field. He needed a location where geography worked to his advantage, where the Persians' superior numbers would become a disadvantage. He found this location at Thermopylae. Thermopylae, meaning hot gates because of the nearby hot springs, was a narrow pass between mountains and the sea. It was the only practical route for a large army to travel from Thessaly to central Greece. The pass was only a few meters wide at its narrowest point, wide enough for perhaps 50 men to march side by side. For Leonidas, Thermopylae offered the perfect opportunity to deny the Persians their numerical advantage. In such a narrow space, Xerxes could only attack with a small fraction of his army at a time. The Spartans could use their phalanx formation to maximum effect, creating an impenetrable wall of bronze and iron. But there was a problem. The Ephors had declared this a sacred time when Spartan warriors could not march to war. The Carnea festival was taking place, and violating it would bring the wrath of the gods upon Sparta. Leonidas found a brilliant solution to this religious problem. He wouldn't march with an army. He would march with his personal guard. Technically, this wouldn't violate religious rules. His personal guard happened to consist of exactly 300 of the finest Spartan warriors, all men who had already fathered sons to continue their bloodlines. These 300 men were not chosen at random. Leonidas personally selected each of them based not only on combat ability, but also on character and loyalty. He needed men who would not break under pressure, who would fight to the death without questioning orders. As Leonidas marched north with his 300 Spartans, other Greek states sent small forces to join him. The Thespians sent 700 men, Thebans 400, and several other cities contributed smaller troops. In total, the Greek force at Thermopylae numbered about 7,000 men, but everyone knew that the core of the resistance were the 300 Spartans. They were the backbone around which the entire defense would be organized. When the Greeks arrived at Thermopylae, they immediately began strengthening their positions. They rebuilt an ancient wall that blocked the pass, creating a barrier behind which they could fight. They established lookout positions on the slopes to watch for the Persians' approach. Most importantly, they began training as a combined unit. Leonidas's Greek allies lacked the Spartans' rigorous discipline, but they were capable warriors desperate to protect their hometowns. Under Leonidas's leadership, they quickly learned to coordinate their movements with the mechanical precision of the Spartan phalanx. Meanwhile, Xerxes' army continued its unstoppable march south. City after city surrendered or was destroyed. The very earth seemed to groan under the weight of so many marching men and animals. Rivers dried up when the army stopped to drink, and entire forests were consumed to fuel the campfires. Xerxes had brought with him not just soldiers, but the entire apparatus of an empire on the move. There were scribes to keep records, engineers to build bridges and siege engines, doctors to treat the wounded, and even historians to record his glorious conquests. Xerxes himself traveled with imperial pomp. His tent was the size of a palace, decorated with silk and gold tapestries. He ate from gold and silver plates and was served by hundreds of servants. Even on campaign, he maintained the luxury and ceremony of a Persian god-king. When Persian scouts reported that a small group of Greeks was blocking the pass at Thermopylae, Xerxes initially disbelieved. How could a few thousand men dare oppose his immense army? Surely, it was some kind of misunderstanding. He sent a horseman to observe the Greeks more closely. What the man reported when he returned must have seemed bizarre to Xerxes. The Spartans were exercising and combing their long hair. They seemed completely unconcerned about the approach of the world's largest army. Some sat on the rocks, sharpening their weapons with whetstones. Others were practicing combat moves, their spears gleaming in the sun. Xerxes consulted Demaratus, a former exiled Spartan king who now served as his advisor on Greek affairs. Demaratus explained that the Spartans always prepared their hair carefully before battle. especially when they expected to die. It was a ritual that meant they had accepted their fate and were ready to meet death with honor. Still, Xerxes couldn't believe that so few men actually intended to fight him. He sent a messenger with a generous offer. The Greeks could join his army and would be richly rewarded. They would receive land, gold, and positions of honor in the Persian Empire. Leonidas listened to the offer in silence, then replied simply, "Molenlebe, come and take them." When the messenger asked what he was talking about, Leonidas pointed to the Spartans' weapons. If Xerxes wanted his weapons, he would have to come and take them from the Spartans' cold bodies. This defiant response infuriated Xerxes. He sent another messenger with a threat. His army was so vast that when they fired their arrows, they would block out the sun. The Spartan response attributed to the warrior Dienicus would become legendary. So much the better. "We will fight in the shade." Xerxes realized that negotiations were pointless. These Greeks had apparently lost their reason. Very well, he would crush them like insects and move on. He gave the Greeks 4 days to think about their impossible situation and reconsider. Surely, when they saw the entirety of his army unfold before them, reason would prevail. For 4 days, the two armies watched each other across the pass. For the Greeks, it must have been a sight that tested the strongest nerves. The Persian army stretched as far as the eye could see, a solid mass of humanity that covered entire plains. The noise of so many men and animals was deafening, a constant roar of voices, horses' hooves, and metal clashing against metal. For the Persians, the sight of the Greeks must have been equally confusing. Those few thousand men remained in their positions, seemingly undaunted by the spectacle before them. They continued their daily drills, kept their weapons in perfect condition, and seemed genuinely prepared to fight to the death. On the 5th day, Xerxes decided he had waited long enough. He ordered his best soldiers to attack and clear the pass. He chose the Medes for the first assault wave, seasoned warriors who had won countless battles for the empire. The Medes attacked confidently, hoping to quickly sweep away the few Greeks before them. They had faced phalanxes before, and had always found ways to break them through sheer numbers or flanking. But Thermopylae was unlike any battle they had faced before. The pass forced the Medes to attack on a narrow front, denying them any opportunity to use their numerical superiority. Worse still, the rocky and uneven terrain made it difficult to maintain organized formations. The Medes found themselves attacking in a disorganized mass against a perfectly organized wall of shields and spears. The Spartans executed their phalanx formation with mechanical precision. Their shields overlapped like fish scales, creating a virtually impenetrable bronze barrier. Their spears stuck out between their shields like the quills of a giant porcupine. When the Medes attacked, they crashed against this wall like waves against rocks. Spartan discipline showed its true strength in this first clash. While individual Mede warriors might have been equal or even superior to individual Greek warriors, they could not compete with the perfect coordination of the phalanx. Each Spartan knew precisely his position, role, and movements. They fought not as individuals, but as parts of a single war machine. Persian spears were shorter than Greek ones, forcing them to come closer to strike their enemies. But this put them within deadly range of Spartan spears. The first Medes to reach the Greek line were killed before they could land a single blow. Those who made it past the spears found themselves facing the Spartans' massive shields and short swords. Shields weren't just for defense. The Spartans used them as weapons, thrusting and striking with their sharp bronze edges. But the most demoralizing aspect of the Spartan phalanx was its relentlessness. When one warrior fell, another immediately took his place. The formation never broke, never wavered, never showed signs of tiredness or fear. It was like fighting against a living wall that constantly repaired itself. After hours of bloody fighting, the Medes retreated in disarray. Hundreds of their best warriors lay dead in the pass, while the Greeks had lost only a few men. Xerxes watched this retreat with growing disbelief. How had his seasoned soldiers been pushed back by such a small force? Determined to break Greek resistance quickly, Xerxes sent his next elite unit, the Scythians. These were mountain warriors known for their ferocity and endurance. Surely they would succeed where the Medes had failed, but the Scythians met with exactly the same result. The Greek formation remained solid, their spears deadly and their shields impenetrable. Hundreds more Persians died trying to break a line that seemed impossible to break. Xerxes then unleashed the might of his regular infantry. Thousands of Persian, Parthian, Saka, and other imperial troops, wave after wave, slammed into the Greek phalanx only to be repulsed with terrible losses. What made the situation even more frustrating for Xerxes was that he couldn't use most of his army. The narrow pass meant only a few hundred men could fight at a time. The rest of his vast army could do nothing but watch their comrades die. The Greeks, on the other hand, were fighting the perfect battle for their capabilities. The hoplite phalanx had been developed precisely for this type of combat: formation against formation, discipline against numbers, quality against quantity. At Thermopylae, all the factors were aligned in their favor. Leonidas proved himself not only a fierce warrior but also a brilliant tactical commander. He rotated his troops regularly, keeping fresh men on the front lines while allowing the tired ones to rest. He used the geography of the pass to maximize his advantages and minimize those of the Persians. More importantly, Leonidas understood the psychological aspect of battle. Each successful repulsion of a Persian attack boosted Greek confidence and lowered Persian morale. His men began to believe they could truly hold off the most powerful army in the world. As the first day of battle drew to a close, Xerxes was facing a crisis of credibility. His soldiers had suffered thousands of casualties while the Greeks remained virtually untouched. Worse still, news of Greek resistance was spreading through the army, causing murmurs of doubt and concern. On the morning of the second day, Xerxes decided to deploy his most feared weapon, the Immortals. This was his personal elite guard, 10,000 warriors who were considered the finest soldiers in the empire. They were called the Immortals because their numbers never dwindled. Whenever one died or was injured, another immediately took his place. The Immortals were equipped with the finest weapons and armor Persian gold could buy. Their shields were decorated with gold and silver. Their spears were tipped with iron forged by the empire's finest blacksmiths, and their armor was made of the finest leather and metal breastplates. More importantly, the Immortals were veterans of dozens of campaigns. They had conquered cities, defeated armies, and expanded the borders of the Persian Empire from India to Egypt. If anyone could break the Greek line, it was they. Xerxes personally led the Immortals to the edge of the pass, then retreated to a golden throne on a nearby hill from where he could observe the battle. He expected to watch his finest warriors sweep away the stubborn Greeks in a matter of minutes. The Immortals attacked with discipline and coordination that rivaled that of the Spartans themselves. They advanced in tight formation, their shields overlapping and their spears pointed forward. For a moment it seemed they might succeed where the others had failed, but then they clashed with the Spartan phalanx, and the brutal reality of Thermopylae's geography reasserted itself. No matter how skilled the Immortals were individually, they were still forced to fight on terrain that took away all their advantages. Worse still for the Persians, the Spartans had now fought for a full day against the best the empire had to offer. They had seen that they could withstand any attack, no matter how fierce. Their confidence was at its peak, and they fought with a savage fury of men who knew they were making history. The battle between the Immortals and the Spartans was the most intense of the conflict so far. For hours, the two elite groups clashed, neither giving ground, neither showing signs of breaking. The sound of metal clashing against metal echoed through the pass like a continuous thunderclap, but gradually superior Spartan discipline began to prevail. The Immortals, despite their skill, were not used to fighting in such rigid formations for such long periods. They began to lose cohesion, allowing the Spartans to exploit small gaps in their lines. Leonidas chose this moment for one of his most brilliant tactical maneuvers. He ordered his men to fake a retreat, breaking their formation and retreating rapidly down the pass. The immortals, thinking they had finally broken the Greek resistance, pursued with enthusiasm, their own formations breaking up in the excitement of their apparent victory. But it was a trap. When the Persians were completely disorganized in their pursuit, the Spartans turned and reformed their phalanx with astonishing speed. The immortals found themselves running straight into a restored wall of shields and spears, with no time to reorganize or defend themselves properly. The result was a massacre. Hundreds of immortals were killed in the minutes that followed, trapped between the reformed phalanx and the rocky terrain of the pass. Those who managed to escape fled in total panic, something never before seen in the unit's proud history. Xerxes watched this disaster from his golden throne with growing horror. His immortals, the empire's most feared warriors, men who had conquered entire nations, had been humbled by a few thousand stubborn Greeks. But the Spartans' faked retreat revealed something even more disturbing. Not only were they superior warriors individually, but they were also sophisticated tacticians capable of executing complex maneuvers under extreme pressure. This wasn't merely brute courage. It was military mastery at the highest level. That night, Xerxes summoned his generals to a council of war. For the first time since the campaign began, there was real doubt in their discussions. How could they overcome a defense that had withstood the best the empire had to offer? Some generals suggested a long siege. The Greeks would eventually run out of food and water and be forced to surrender. Others proposed naval attacks to outflank the Greek position from the sea. But Xerxes rejected both options. A siege would have taken weeks or months, delaying the entire campaign and allowing other Greek states to prepare for resistance. Naval attacks were impossible due to the rough waters and the cliffs near the coast. It was then that a local Greek shepherd named Ephialtes arrived at the Persian camp. He brought information that would completely change the course of the battle and history. Ephialtes revealed the existence of a narrow mountain trail that went around Thermopylae and came out behind the Greek position. This trail, known as the Oenopeia path, was steep and dangerous, but it would allow a small force to completely outflank the Greek defenses. Xerxes immediately saw the potential of this information. He didn't need to break the Greek phalanx head-on. He could simply go around it. Better yet, once a Persian force emerged behind the Greeks, they would be forced to fight on two fronts, breaking the tactical advantage they had held for 2 days. Command of the flanking force was given to Hydarnes, one of Xerxes' most trusted generals and commander of the Immortals. He selected 20,000 men from his best troops for the mission. They would set out at night, follow the mountain trail in the dark, and attack the Greeks from the rear at dawn. But Leonidas was no novice in military tactics. He had considered the possibility of flanking from the moment he chose to defend Thermopylae. He knew there must be a way through the mountains. He had consulted local guides and posted guards along known paths. The Oenopeia trail was guarded by 1,000 Phocian soldiers, Greek allies who knew the local terrain well. They were ordered to defend the route at all costs and to send messengers immediately if they saw any Persian movement. During the night of the second day, Hydarnes silently led his force up the mountain trail. It was a risky move. The trail was narrow and dangerous, especially in the dark. One false step could send a man plummeting down the cliffs. But the Persians advanced with determination, knowing that the success of this maneuver could decide the entire campaign. At dawn on the third day, the Phocian sentries finally spotted the Persian flanking force emerging from the morning mist, but it was too late to mount an effective defense. The Phocians fought bravely, but were quickly overwhelmed by the superior numbers of well-rested Persians. Some Phocians managed to escape and ran to warn Leonidas of the impending flanking. When the news reached the Greek camp, the situation became immediately clear to everyone. Within hours, the Persians would be attacking from behind. The defensive position that had been their salvation would become their trap. Leonidas immediately called a council of war with his allies. The situation was desperate, but there were still options. They could try to retreat before the flanking was complete, preserving their forces to fight another day. Or they could remain and fight to the death, knowing it would be a final battle. Most of the allied contingents chose to retreat. The Thespians, Thebans, and other groups began withdrawing from the pass, taking most of the defensive force with them. This wasn't cowardice. It was military good sense. Dying at Thermopylae wouldn't save Greece if there weren't more soldiers to defend other positions, but Leonidas and his 300 Spartans remained. For them, retreat was unthinkable. They had come to Thermopylae to die, and they would fulfill that promise. The Delphic prophecy had said that either Sparta would be destroyed, or one of its kings would die defending it. Leonidas had chosen his fate. With them remained some loyal allies. 700 Thespians refused to abandon the Spartans, saying it was better to die with honor than live in shame. 400 Thebans also remained, though some historians suggest they were forced to stay as hostages. As the morning wore on, the remaining Greeks prepared for their final battle. They knew they were doomed, but they were determined to sell their lives as dearly as possible. Every Persian they killed would be one less to threaten the rest of Greece. Xerxes ordered a massive frontal assault to coordinate with Hydarnes' flanking. He wanted to crush the remaining Greeks completely, leaving no survivors to tell the tale of their stubborn resistance. Thousands of Persians attacked the diminished Greek phalanx from all directions. This time the numbers were overwhelmingly against the defenders, where before they had faced attacks from only one direction. Now the Persians came from the front, from the sides, and from the rear. But even in this impossible situation, the Spartans continued to fight with the discipline and ferocity that had made them legendary. They formed a defensive circle, their spears pointing outward like the spines of a giant hedgehog. Each man knew he was fighting not only for his own life, but for the honor of Sparta and the freedom of all Greece. The battle was fierce beyond description. The Spartans fought with spears until they broke, then switched to swords. When their swords broke or were lost, they fought with daggers, stones, and even bare hands. They were determined to make every Persian pay a bloody price for their victory. Leonidas fought on the front lines like any of his men. Despite his age, he moved with the deadly grace of a warrior in his prime, his spear finding target after target among the Persian attackers. Enemy soldiers fell before him like mown wheat, but even the greatest warriors are mortal. A Persian arrow found a gap in Leonidas's armor, and the Spartan king fell. His men immediately gathered around his body, determined to protect him even in death. A fierce battle erupted over the king's body, with Greeks and Persians dying in heaps around the fallen warrior. As the Spartans were gradually overwhelmed, they retreated to a small hill within the pass. It was their last stand, a small rocky mound where they would make their final stand. Surrounded by thousands of enemies, their weapons broken, and their ranks devastated, they still refused to surrender. The Persians, frustrated by their heavy losses and furious at the continued resistance, finally resorted to ranged attacks. They surrounded the hill and rained a deadly hail of arrows on the surviving Greeks. The arrows fell so thickly that they actually blocked the sun, fulfilling the Persian threat of days earlier. One by one, the last defenders of Thermopylae fell. Some were killed by arrows, others succumbed to wounds sustained in hand-to-hand combat, but none surrendered. None begged for mercy. They died as they had lived, as Spartans. When silence finally fell over Thermopylae, Xerxes walked across the battlefield to survey the results of his victory. What he found must have deeply disturbed him. Thousands of his best soldiers lay dead, scattered throughout the pass. The price of defeating a few thousand Greeks had been immense, but it was the Greek bodies that were most impressive. They were found in perfect formations. Even in death, they had maintained their discipline to the last man, fighting as a unit until the absolute end. Xerxes found Leonidas's body among the last defenders on the hilltop. Even in death, the Spartan king maintained an expression of serene defiance. In a fit of rage at the trouble this man had caused, Xerxes ordered the body beheaded and crucified, a final insult to the warrior who had dared to defy him. But this action only served to show how deeply the Spartans had affected the great king. In his entire career of conquest, Xerxes had never been forced into such public humiliation. The fact that he felt the need to mutilate the body of a dead enemy showed how deeply the defense of Thermopylae had wounded his pride. News of the battle spread quickly throughout Greece. All 300 Spartans had died, but their deaths had accomplished something that had seemed impossible just days before. They had shown that the Persians could be wounded, that Xerxes' army was not invincible. More importantly, they had bought precious time for the rest of Greece to prepare. The 3 days of battle at Thermopylae allowed Athens to complete the evacuation of its citizens and other city-states to gather their forces. The sacrifice of the 300 had not been in vain. The final words attributed to the Spartans at Thermopylae have become legendary. When a Greek traitor warned that Persian arrows were so numerous they would block out the sun, the Spartan warrior Dienicus supposedly replied, "So much the better. We will fight in the shade." When Xerxes demanded that they surrender their weapons, Leonidas replied simply, "Mollen Leb, come and get them." These phrases perfectly captured the spirit that made the Spartans unique among the warriors of the ancient world. They fought not just for victory. They fought for honor, freedom, and the ideals they considered more important than life itself. The epitaph later placed at the battle site perfectly summed up the Spartans' sacrifice. "Stranger, go tell the Spartans that here we lie, obedient to their laws." It was a simple yet profound statement. The 300 had died not in vain defiance, but in obedience to the deepest values of their city. Xerxes continued his march south, but something had fundamentally changed. His aura of invincibility had been shattered. His soldiers had seen that Greeks could fight and die with courage equal to his own. Doubts began to spread through the Persian army about whether this campaign would be the easy victory they had hoped for. When the Persian army finally reached Athens, they found an empty city. The Athenians had completely evacuated, retreating to the island of Salamis and other sea fortresses. Xerxes burned the empty city in frustration, but it was a hollow victory with no people to enslave or riches to plunder. The true decision of the war came a few months later in the waters near Salamis. The Greek fleet under the command of the cunning Themistocles lured the Persian armada into the narrow waters between Salamis and the mainland. There, using tactics similar to those that had worked so well at Thermopylae, the Greeks turned the Persian numerical superiority into a disadvantage. The Persian ships, squeezed into the narrow waters, were unable to maneuver effectively. The more nimble Greek triremes attacked them from all sides, sinking hundreds of Persian ships while suffering minimal losses themselves. Xerxes watched from a throne on the shore as his invincible armada was destroyed before his eyes. The defeat at Salamis broke the backbone of the Persian campaign. Without sea control, Xerxes could no longer properly supply his massive army. He was forced to withdraw most of his forces back to Asia, leaving only a reduced force under the command of General Mardonius to continue the campaign. The following year, this remnant army was utterly destroyed by the united Greeks at the Battle of Plataea. The Persian threat to Greece had been definitively eliminated, and the course of Western history was forever altered. But it all began in a small, rocky pass called Thermopylae, where 300 Spartans proved that courage, discipline, and superior tactics could triumph over seemingly impossible numbers. They showed the world that freedom was worth any price, and that free men would fight more fiercely than slaves to any tyrant. The legacy of Thermopylae extended far beyond ancient Greece. The story of the 300 inspired future generations of soldiers and leaders. Alexander the Great carried a copy of Homer's Iliad on his campaigns, but he also knew the stories of the heroes of Thermopylae by heart. The Romans, who would eventually conquer Greece, held the Spartans in deep respect. They saw in Sparta a model of military discipline and civic virtue that they sought to copy in their own empire. The Spartan Phalanx influenced the development of the Roman legionary formation, which would dominate battlefields for centuries. During the Renaissance, when scholars rediscovered classical texts, the story of Thermopylae was reread as an example of how a small force of free men could resist tyranny. The American founding fathers knew the story well, and saw it as a precedent for their own struggle against the British Empire. But perhaps the most impressive aspect of the Battle of Thermopylae wasn't the Spartans' courage, though that was extraordinary. It was their tactical innovation. Leonidas's faked retreat maneuver against the Immortals was a brilliant example of strategic thinking under extreme pressure. This tactic, luring the enemy into a trap by faking weakness, would become a staple of warfare for centuries to come. Hannibal used it against the Romans at Cannae, inflicting one of the most devastating defeats in Roman military history. Medieval generals employed it against heavy cavalry, even in modern warfare. The principle of luring the enemy into a disadvantageous position remains relevant. The Spartan Phalanx itself was a revolutionary innovation for its time. The idea of soldiers fighting in rigidly disciplined formation, each man completely dependent on his comrades, created unprecedented combat effectiveness. It was a military manifestation of Greek political values, the city-state, where every citizen had a role to play, and where the common good trumped individual interests. This connection between military structure and social values was no coincidence. The Phalanx only functioned with soldiers who were genuinely committed to each other and their common cause. Mercenaries or forced soldiers could never maintain the necessary discipline under extreme pressure. What was required was the fierce loyalty that came from men fighting for their homes, their families, and their freedom. The Persians, despite all their resources and power, never managed to develop this kind of cohesion. Their army was a coalition of conquered peoples, many fighting more out of fear than conviction. When they faced real adversity at Thermopylae, these internal divisions became apparent. The battle also showed the crucial importance of terrain in ancient warfare. Leonidas understood that geography could be as important as men and weapons. By choosing to fight at Thermopylae, he turned the Greeks' greatest weakness, their inferior numbers, into an advantage. This lesson would be repeated many times in military history. From Agincourt to Gettysburg, clever commanders used difficult terrain to deny their enemies their numerical advantages. The ability to read a battlefield and position forces for maximum effect distinguishes great generals from merely competent ones. But Thermopylae taught an even more profound lesson about the nature of leadership. Leonidas did not command from afar, as Xerxes did from his golden throne. He fought on the front lines, sharing every danger he asked his men to face. This leadership by example inspired a level of loyalty and commitment that no amount of threats or rewards could match. This tradition of leading from the front would continue to characterize the best military commanders throughout history. From Alexander marching his men across the deserts of Asia to modern officers leading charges under enemy fire. The most effective leaders were those who shared the sacrifices they demanded of others. The story of Thermopylae also shows how small groups of committed individuals can have an outsized impact on history. 300 men changed the course of a war that involved millions. They did so not through superior numbers or resources, but through superior preparation, superior discipline, and superior commitment to their cause. This lesson echoes through the centuries, from small bands of revolutionaries changing entire empires to small teams of innovators transforming industries. History is full of examples of how determination and excellence can triumph over seemingly impossible odds. Perhaps the most moving aspect of the Thermopylae story is the Spartans' calm acceptance of death. They didn't go into battle expecting to survive. They went knowing they would die, but determined to make their deaths meaningful. They understood that sometimes the greatest service one can give is to give one's life for the freedom of others. This willingness to make the ultimate sacrifice distinguishes true heroes from mere warriors. Anyone can fight when there is hope of victory and reward. It takes a special kind of courage to fight when you know death is certain, but the principle at stake is worth more than individual life. The Spartans at Thermopylae weren't just defending a piece of territory. They were defending an idea, the idea that free people had the right to determine their own destiny, that no tyrant, no matter how powerful, had the right to enslave free men. This idea, born in the Greek city-states and sealed in blood at Thermopylae, would eventually spread throughout the world. It would inspire revolutions, topple empires, and shape the course of human civilization. The values for which the Spartans died, freedom, democracy, self-determination, would become the foundations of the modern world. Today, more than 2,000 years later, we still tell the story of the 300 Spartans. We still draw inspiration from their courage, admire their discipline, and respect their sacrifice. In a world where it's easy to be cynical about heroism and idealism, Thermopylae stands as a reminder that some things are truly worth dying to defend. The Battle of Thermopylae proved that it's not the size of the army that matters, but the size of the hearts of the warriors who make it up. It proved that discipline can overcome chaos, that quality can triumph over quantity, and that free men will fight more fiercely than slaves. More importantly, it proved that sometimes a defeat can be more powerful than a victory. The Spartans lost the battle, but they gained something far more valuable. They gained immortality. Their story continues to inspire, teach, and elevate the human spirit. So the next time you face seemingly impossible odds, remember the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae. Remember that courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to do what is right despite fear. Remember that true victory sometimes comes not in winning, but in refusing to be defeated. And remember the immortal words engraved on the memorial at Thermopylae. Stranger, go tell the Spartans that here we lie, obedient to their laws. They died not in vain rebellion, but in obedience to the highest values of their civilization. They showed us that there are things more important than individual life, and that sometimes, paradoxically, only by being willing to sacrifice life can one truly live it. The story of the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae remains, after all these centuries, one of the greatest examples of courage, discipline, and sacrifice in human history. It is a story that continues to inspire us, teach us, and remind us of the best we are capable of when we face our greatest challenges. And as we think about this extraordinary display of human valor, we cannot help but recognize that there is something greater that governs the destiny of nations and men. The Spartans fought with unparalleled courage, but it was the Lord God who, in His infinite wisdom, allowed this battle to become a defining moment in human history. Through the centuries, we see the hand of Providence shaping events that seem to be mere clashes between mortal men. The resistance at Thermopylae, the later victory at Salamis, and the preservation of the ideals of freedom and democracy that flourish to this day, all part of a much grander plan than only human minds could conceive. May we have the humility to recognize that while we celebrate human courage and sacrifice, it is the Lord God who ultimately directs the course of history and grants us the strength to face our own challenges with the same determination that the heroes of Thermopylae demonstrated more than 2,000 years ago.